the new title of our podcast could be "Things Don't Suck as Much as You Think," but this is an attempt to say how you look at your present and what you think and believe about your future does have an intimate relationship to what that future is going to be, that we are all, as it were, in the process of writing our future, and that how we write that matters, and that if you write your future through the lens of intense pessimism and negativity, there's a collective ability to talk yourselves into the very things that you fear most. I don't think we're the first things to say this. We're not the first to believe it. It is hard to prove absolute causation between contemporary attitudes and future outcomes, but this is predicated on, I think, a pretty strong foundation of how you frame your problems, and your ability to solve them has a lot to do with whether or not you're able to solve them. So, hence why what could go right in a world where we are all focused and tend to be focused on everything that's going wrong. So, Emma, what do you think were some of the more compelling themes that we talked about over the past, I think, 18 episodes?
All right, so I'm going to go forward on the things suck, but maybe they don't suck as much as you think they do, or they don't suck as much as they could part of the intro. So I was thinking today a lot about our episode with Steve Inskeep, and he's an NPR anchor, and he had written a book about Lincoln. And what he mentioned on the podcast that I found really striking, which is it was an answer to a question that you had, where we are a little bit obsessed, a little bit less now than we were during Trump's presidency, but we are definitely still in this era of asking and making parallels between the 1850s and now. Like, are we headed for a civil war question, right?
I don't think at this moment that we're heading for a civil war. I don't see how that would happen. The reason being is that I don't really understand what it would be about. In the 1850s, there was this dispute over slavery, which was not only human bondage for 4 million people, as if that wasn't enough to argue about. It was really an entire economic and social system of a large part of the United States, an economic and social system that the rest of the United States benefited from in different ways, even if they didn't participate in it. And so there were enormous, enormous questions about who belonged in society and who didn't, how the economy should be organized or not, who should call the shots or who not. There were enormous questions to wrestle with. And even though we have profound differences today, it's hard to see them as that same kind of division, just because so much of it is propaganda and performance and attitude and cultural touchstones and preferred media, all of which become real in a sense. I mean, they mean something to voters, and they drive elections, and they drive our divisions and how we feel. But would that many people really take up arms, millions of people take up arms to fight about them? I don't see that yet. I mean, the possibility of political violence, yes. I mean, that's always with us. And in fact, some kind of political violence is, almost any given year, you could find something that would fall into that category in America. There could be more, there could be less. I'm not worried about a civil war in that sense.
It was so striking to me because I feel like when I think about fear and the atmospheres of fear that I think Trump in particular engenders in a lot of people, particularly on the left in the United States, we end up talking about that fear without also taking in a sober-minded way, the sort of constraints of reality, right? Like like as you say a lot, our fears of the future might come true, but we sometimes don't adequately take into account what would be the barriers to that along the way. And do these fears that are kind of occupying our mind and taking up so much of our energy, do they even really make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I was struck as well, both in our conversation with Steve Inskeep and last season in our conversation with John Avalon, who also wrote a book about the prelude to the Civil War, that, look, the 1850s in particular has gotten somewhat more prominent in our contemporary mindset. Just like as I joked about with Jared Cohen in my interview with him, Grover Cleveland is suddenly weirdly relevant to Donald Trump, given that he's the only other person who ran for office, lost came back and won another non-consecutive term. But the 1850s is a kind of harbinger of the most violent, divisive, existential crisis the United States has actually ever faced. And you have an emotional climate today that clearly has echoes of that. But whether you have a structural one or whether or not we're kind of overdoing it, I mean, certainly from Inskeep's book, and I think from our conversation, and certainly from my own historical perspective, there's nowhere near the kind of divisiveness today that marked that period of time. There isn't like active willingness to fight to the death, literally, or kill for some of these things. I mean, I'm sure that's true for some people, right? But that's always true for some people at any given time in any society. I don't even think we're as divisive as we were in 1968. That was a big question in the summer of 2020 with the riots and George Floyd and the kind of tumult of pandemic land, whether or not we were coming apart at the seams the way people felt in 1968 in that sort of radical summer before the Democratic Convention and Johnson stepping down and Kennedy and Martin Luther King getting assassinated. And this is where I do think history is helpful in that before one gets too hyperbolic about the present, it does bear to remember how things have been in the past and how we have muddled through or navigated or not, as the case may be. And I agree. I think Inskeep's book was a reminder of, yes, things can spin out of control in a way that leads to war and death and fighting. But the conditions for that are pretty unusual and extreme, and we shouldn't be quite so quick to go down that path of fear.